In the shadowed hollows of the Ozark Mountains, where morning mists clung to the ridges like ghosts of forgotten prayers, and ancient Cherokee spirits still walked among the towering oaks and hickories, the autumn of 1889 brought with it a fever that swept through the isolated frontier settlement of Whitlock's Crossing, like divine wrath made manifest in mortal flesh. The disease struck without warning or mercy, claiming the young and old alike with a voracity that left the small mountain community reeling from losses that challenged their faith and tested their understanding of divine providence in ways that their simple frontier theology was unprepared to address. The settlement itself sat, nestled in a valley that seemed carved by God's own hand from the ancient limestone bedrock that formed the backbone of the Ozark Range. Steep ridges rose on all sides, their slopes covered with virgin timber that had never felt the bite of an axe except where absolutely necessary for building the handful of log cabins that housed the 47 families who called this remote place home. The isolation that protected them from the corrupting influences of civilization also meant that when disaster struck, they faced it alone, with only their faith and their neighbors to sustain them through trials that would test the limits of human endurance. Rose Harper, barely 8 years old, and possessed of the kind of innocent beauty that seemed to capture the very essence of mountain wildflowers in human form, had been among the first to succumb to the mysterious ailment that left its victims burning with fever while their bodies grew cold as winter stones. Her small frame, delicate as morning frost on autumn leaves, had fought the disease with the determined spirit that characterized the Ozark mountain folk. But even her mother's constant prayers and the ministrations of Dr. Samuel Crawford could not prevent the inevitable conclusion that awaited all mortal flesh when the hand of death reached forth to claim what it would. Child's beauty was of the ethereal sort that artists struggle to capture on canvas, as though some divine spark illuminated her features from within. Her hair fell in golden cascades that caught sunlight and held it prisoner, while her eyes, those clear blue pools that would soon be transformed into windows of unspeakable horror, reflected the purity of mountain streams and the innocence of lambs grazing in highland meadows. When she smiled, which was often in those days before sickness claimed her, her entire face radiated a joy that seemed to bless everyone who witnessed it. Martha Harper, Rose's mother, was a woman whose own beauty had been tempered by the harsh realities of frontier life, but whose spirit remained unbroken despite losing her husband in a logging accident 3 years earlier. She had raised Rose with the firm discipline that mountain life demanded, while nurturing the child's naturally sweet disposition and deep religious faith. Mother and daughter were inseparable, working together in their small garden, attending church services in Whitlock Chapel, and spending long winter evenings reading from the family Bible by firelight. The Harper homestead, like most in the settlement, was a testament to frontier self-reliance and the ingenuity born of necessity. The main cabin, built from massive chestnut logs that had been felled and shaped by Martha's late husband, stood solid against the mountain weather with walls thick enough to keep out winter's worst fury. A stone chimney dominated one end of the structure, its hearth serving as the heart of the home where meals were cooked, warmth was shared, and family prayers were offered each morning and evening. Behind the cabin stood the outbuildings that made frontier life possible, a smokehouse for preserving meat, a root cellar dug deep into the hillside for storing vegetables through the long winter months, a chicken coop that housed a dozen laying hens, and a small barn that sheltered their milk cow and the mule that helped with heavy farm work. A clear spring bubbled from the rocks 50 yards uphill from the cabin, providing fresh water that Martha and Rose carried in wooden buckets twice daily. The settlement's spiritual center was Whitlock Chapel, a sturdy log structure that Reverend Josiah Whitlock had helped build with his own hands when he first arrived to minister to the scattered families of the remote valley. The building was simple but solid, with hand-hewn pews that could seat perhaps 60 people when the entire community gathered for worship. A plain wooden cross hung behind the pulpit, carved from oak by one of the local craftsmen and polished smooth by countless hours of prayer and meditation. Reverend Josiah Whitlock, the frontier preacher whose rough-hewn chapel served as the spiritual center for the scattered families that called the remote valley home, had watched with growing anguish as the fever claimed victim after victim from his small congregation. As a man of God who had dedicated his life to providing comfort and guidance to the mountain folk who lived beyond the reach of civilized society's religious institutions, he found himself confronting questions about divine justice and mercy that his theological training had never adequately prepared him to answer. Whitlock was a man in his mid-50s whose weathered face bore the marks of decades spent in outdoor ministry among people who respected actions more than words. His hands, scarred from years of splitting wood and helping neighbors build homes and barns, could deliver a baby as skillfully as they could conduct a funeral service. His voice, roughened by countless sermons preached in the open air, could comfort a grieving mother or thunder with righteous indignation against sin and corruption. The preacher had come to the Ozarks after serving churches in more civilized areas where congregations expected eloquent sermons and refined theology. But he had found his true calling among these mountain people whose faith was as solid as the bedrock beneath their feet, and whose need for spiritual guidance was as real as their daily struggle for survival. He had learned to speak their language, to understand their customs, and to minister to their needs with a practical Christianity that emphasized service over ceremony. Rose Harper had been the shining light of his Sunday school classes, a child whose genuine faith and innocent questions about Scripture had reminded him of why he had chosen to serve God in these remote mountains rather than seeking a comfortable position in some established town church where the challenges were less severe, but the rewards were also less meaningful. Her eager participation in church activities, her sweet voice raised in hymns that echoed through the log walls of Whitlock Chapel, and her generous spirit in helping her mother Martha collect food and clothing for families even poorer than their own, had made her beloved by the entire community. The child's religious education had been thorough, despite the limitations of frontier life. Martha Harper, though lacking formal education herself, had memorized vast portions of Scripture during her own childhood and passed this knowledge to her daughter through daily Bible readings and discussions that explored the practical application of Christian principles to mountain life. Rose could recite the 23rd Psalm with the fluidity of natural speech, knew the stories of Jesus with intimate familiarity, and understood the concepts of sin and salvation with a maturity that often surprised adults who underestimated her spiritual development. Dr. Samuel Crawford, whose medical practice served families scattered across 50 square miles of rugged mountain terrain, had established himself as one of the most respected members of the community through his dedication to healing and his willingness to travel any distance in any weather to answer calls for help. His medical bag, worn smooth by constant use, contained the limited but effective remedies available to frontier physicians: quinine for fevers, laudanum for pain, carbolic acid for disinfection, and various herbal preparations that he had learned from Cherokee healers who still lived in the most remote areas. Crawford had the physician's relationship with the Harper family went back to Rose's birth, when he had delivered the child during a difficult labor that might have claimed both mother and daughter without his skilled intervention. He had watched Rose grow from a delicate infant into a vibrant child whose health had never given cause for concern until the fever epidemic struck the settlement with its mysterious and deadly symptoms. The disease itself defied Crawford's medical understanding and challenged every treatment method he had learned during his formal education and years of frontier practice. It began with symptoms that resembled common childhood ailments: slight fever, fatigue, loss of appetite, but rapidly progressed to conditions that seemed to attack the very essence of life itself. Victims burned with internal fire while their extremities grew cold. Their minds remained clear while their bodies failed, and most puzzling of all, they seemed to be dying from the inside out, rather than succumbing to any identifiable pathological process. Crawford's medical journal, meticulously maintained throughout his career, documented case after case of patients who followed the same terrible pattern. The fever would begin gradually, often mistaken for seasonal illness, then escalate with frightening rapidity as the victim's body temperature rose to levels that should have caused immediate death. Yet the patients remained conscious and articulate even as their physical condition deteriorated beyond anything in medical literature. Rose Harper's illness had begun on October 15th with symptoms that Dr. Crawford initially dismissed as nothing more serious than the seasonal ailments that regularly affected mountain children during the transition from warm autumn days to cold mountain nights. The child had complained of feeling tired after helping her mother with the daily chores, picking apples in their small orchard and gathering late vegetables from the garden plot behind their cabin. Martha had noticed that Rose felt slightly warm to the touch, but attributed this to physical exertion and the unusually humid weather that had preceded the first frost. By evening, however, Rose's condition had deteriorated with frightening rapidity, her small body burning with fever that seemed to originate from some internal fire that could not be cooled by any of the traditional remedies that frontier medicine had developed for treating such conditions. Martha applied cold compresses to her daughter's forehead, gave her small sips of cool water, and began the fervent prayers that would continue without interruption for the next 3 days. Dr. Crawford arrived at the Harper homestead within hours of being summoned, making the difficult ride over mountain trails that were treacherous even in daylight. His examination revealed symptoms that challenged his medical understanding. Rose's temperature was dangerously elevated, yet her skin felt cold to the touch. Her pulse was rapid but weak, as though her heart was struggling to pump blood that had somehow been altered by the disease process. Most puzzling, her eyes remained clear and intelligent despite the severity of her physical condition. The physician tried every treatment in his medical arsenal. He administered quinine to combat the fever, but the child's temperature continued to rise. He applied cooling baths and cold compresses, but these seemed to have no effect on the internal fire consuming her small body. He gave her tiny doses of laudanum to ease her discomfort, but Rose refused most medication, claiming that it made her feel further away from God at a time when she needed to feel closer to divine presence. Martha Harper, a woman whose strength had been forged in the crucible of mountain hardship and whose faith had sustained her through the death of her husband in a logging accident 3 years earlier, had not left her daughter's bedside during the 3 days that the fever raged through Rose's fragile system. She had prayed with an intensity that bordered on desperation, calling upon God with the fervor of a mother whose entire world was contained in the failing breath of her only child. The mother's vigil was a thing of elemental power that seemed to charge the very air of the small cabin with spiritual energy. She recited every prayer she had ever learned, quoted scripture with the fluency of a trained theologian, and bargained with God in the ancient tradition of parents who would sacrifice anything to save their children. Her voice, hoarse from constant prayer, never ceased its supplication even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her mortal frame. Neighbors came and went during those 3 terrible days, bringing food that remained uneaten, offering help that could not be accepted, and adding their own prayers to Martha's desperate petitions. The women of the community took turns sitting with the grieving mother, while the men gathered outside the cabin to speak in hushed tones about the mysterious disease that was claiming so many of their loved ones. Reverend Whitlock maintained a constant presence at the Harper homestead, reading scripture, leading prayers, and offering what comfort he could to a mother who was watching her only child slip away despite every effort to save her. The preacher's own faith was being tested by the epidemic that had already claimed 12 members of his small congregation, including 3 other children whose deaths had shaken the community's belief in divine mercy and justice. The final night of Rose's earthly life was marked by supernatural phenomena that the watchers would remember for the rest of their days. The child, who had been unconscious for hours, suddenly opened her eyes and began speaking in a clear, strong voice about visions that seemed to transport her beyond the physical realm. She described seeing angels with faces like flame and wings that sparkled with starlight, beings who spoke to her in words that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her heart. "They're so beautiful, Mama," Rose whispered as Martha held her small hand. "They're telling me not to be afraid, that death is just like walking through a door into a room filled with light. But there are other things here too, dark things that want to pull me down instead of up. I have to choose which way to go." As dawn approached on October 18th, Rose Harper drew her final breath in the arms of her mother, while Martha Harper's grief was a thing of elemental force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small log cabin where her daughter had been born and where she had now died. Her cries of anguish echoed across the valley, carrying on the morning air to neighbors who recognized the sound of ultimate loss and knew that another family had been broken by the fever that was claiming so many of their loved ones. The sound was primal, rising from depths of human experience that civilization had never touched, expressing sorrow too profound for words or consolation. Reverend Whitlock arrived at the Harper homestead within the hour, having been summoned by neighbors who had heard Martha's cries and knew that pastoral comfort would be needed for a woman who had now lost both husband and child to the harsh realities of mountain life. He found Martha collapsed beside her daughter's bed, her hands still clasped around Rose's small fingers, as though her touch might somehow call the child back from whatever realm she had entered. The preacher's own grief was profound and personal, as Rose had been like a granddaughter to him during the 5 years he had served the Whitlock's Crossing community. Her death represented not just the loss of a beloved child, but a challenge to his faith that struck at the very core of his calling to serve God in a world where innocent children could be taken while hardened sinners continued to thrive. He struggled to find words of comfort that would not sound hollow in the face of such devastating loss. The preparations for Rose's funeral began immediately, following the traditional practices that mountain communities had developed for honoring their dead while acknowledging the practical realities of frontier life that required swift burial to prevent the spread of disease. Reverend Whitlock began composing the words he would speak over the child's grave, struggling to find comfort in scripture that could ease Martha's suffering while maintaining his own faith in divine providence. The church community rallied around the Harper family with the solidarity that characterized mountain folk when faced with tragedy. Women brought food and helped prepare Rose's small body for burial, washing her gently and dressing her in the white dress that Martha had made for her confirmation, which would now serve as her burial shroud. Men constructed the simple wooden coffin that would hold her earthly remains, crafting it with the care usually reserved for fine furniture, and dug the grave in the rocky soil of the hillside cemetery, where other victims of the fever had already been laid to rest. Rose's body was brought to Whitlock Chapel on the evening of October 19th for the traditional 3-day viewing period that allowed community members to pay their final respects and offer comfort to the grieving family. The small log church, illuminated by candles and oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, became a place of pilgrimage for neighbors who had known and loved the child. The chapel had never seemed more sacred than during those 3 days when Rose's small coffin occupied the space before the altar. Wildflowers from the mountain meadows adorned the simple wooden box, placed there by children who had been her playmates, and by adults who remembered her kindness and gentle spirit. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and cedar from the fresh-cut lumber, mixed with the fragrance of autumn flowers and the lingering smell of candle wax. Reverend Whitlock spent those 3 days sitting with Martha beside Rose's coffin, offering what comfort he could while struggling with his own questions about why God would allow such suffering to befall the innocent. The child looked peaceful in death, her small features unmarked by the ravages of fever, appearing to sleep the natural sleep of exhausted childhood rather than the eternal rest of mortality. Her golden hair had been carefully arranged around her face, and her hands were folded over her chest, clutching the small wooden cross that her father had carved for her before his death. Visitors came throughout the viewing period, each bringing their own memories of Rose and their own struggles to understand why one so young and innocent had been taken from them. Children who had played with her brought small treasures, pretty stones, dried flowers, carved wooden toys, placing them in the coffin as gifts for her journey into whatever realm awaited beyond death. Adults shared stories of her kindness, her wisdom beyond her years, and her unwavering faith that had inspired all who knew her. The weather during those 3 days seemed to reflect the community's grief, with gray skies and cold winds that stripped the last leaves from the trees and reminded everyone of winter's approach. Yet inside the chapel, there was warmth and light as people gathered to celebrate a life that, though brief, had touched them all in profound ways. It was on the 3rd day, October 21st, as Reverend Whitlock began the funeral service that would commit Rose's body to the red clay soil of the Ozark hills, that the impossible happened. The preacher had chosen his text from the book of Job, speaking about faith in the face of incomprehensible loss, when he was interrupted by a sound that would haunt the nightmares of everyone present for the rest of their lives, as he spoke the words of committal that had been repeated over countless graves throughout Christian history. Rose Harper's eyes suddenly opened, and she drew a gasping breath, like a person who had been drowning and finally reached the surface of saving water. The sound echoed through the chapel like thunder, causing some congregation members to flee in terror while others fell to their knees in prayer, unsure whether they were witnessing miracle or abomination. The child who sat up in her coffin was recognizably Rose Harper, yet transformed in ways that defied natural explanation and challenged everything the mountain people believed about life. Death and the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms. The moment of Rose Harper's resurrection sent shockwaves through the assembled congregation that transformed the solemn funeral service into a scene of supernatural terror and wonder that would be remembered and whispered about in the Ozark hollows for generations to come. The child who had lain cold and lifeless but the joy that initially flooded through Whitlock Chapel as the congregation realized they were witnessing a resurrection quickly transformed into horror when they saw what Rose had become during her journey through death. Her eyes, which had been the clear blue of mountain springs reflecting summer skies, were now dark pools that seemed to contain infinite depths of knowledge that no child should possess. The transformation was so complete that some observers wondered if this was truly Rose Harper or some other entity that had taken possession of her physical form. When she turned her gaze upon the assembled mourners, they felt as though she were looking not at their physical forms, but directly into their souls, seeing secrets and sins that they had hidden even from themselves. Her stare carried weight and intensity that seemed to penetrate flesh and bone, to examine the spiritual condition of everyone within her sight. Several congregation members found themselves backing away from the coffin, instinctively recognizing that they were in the presence of something that transcended normal human experience. The physical changes in Rose's appearance were immediately obvious to everyone present. Her skin, which had been naturally pale with the healthy flush of childhood, now had the translucent quality of fine porcelain, appearing almost luminous in the candlelight. Her hair, once golden as wheat in summer sunshine, had taken on silvery highlights that seemed to shimmer with their own internal light. Most disturbing of all, her small features had acquired a mature cast that suggested wisdom and experience far beyond her chronological age. Dr. Samuel Crawford, whose medical training had taught him to approach extraordinary claims with scientific skepticism, immediately moved to examine the child who had been pronounced dead by his own professional judgment 3 days earlier. What he discovered challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of life and death during his decades of frontier medical practice. Rose's vital signs were not simply restored, but fundamentally altered in ways that defied medical explanation. Her body temperature was several degrees below normal human ranges, yet she showed no signs of hypothermia or circulatory problems. Her pulse was barely detectable through conventional examination, yet her heart seemed to be functioning adequately to sustain life. Most puzzling, her breathing was so shallow as to be almost imperceptible, yet she spoke clearly and showed no signs of oxygen deprivation. It was as though her body had been adapted to exist according to different physiological rules than those governing normal human biology. But the most shocking discovery during Crawford's examination was the presence of burn marks that had not been present when he had examined her corpse 3 days earlier. The marks appeared across her arms, chest, and back in patterns that resembled symbols from some ancient script or religious iconography that none of the mountain folk could identify. The burns were precise and deliberate, showing characteristics that suggested they had been applied with surgical precision. Rather than random contact with heat or flame, the burn marks glowed with a faint phosphorescence that was visible, even in the candlelit interior of the chapel, pulsing gently with rhythms that seemed to match some internal process beyond normal human physiology. When Dr. Crawford touched them during his examination, they radiated heat that suggested the burns originated from some internal source rather than external contact with fire or heated objects. The temperature was sufficient to be uncomfortable to the touch. Yet Rose showed no signs of pain or distress from what should have been agonizing injuries. The patterns formed by the burn marks were unlike anything in Crawford's medical experience or cultural knowledge. They resembled hieroglyphic writing in their complexity and systematic arrangement, yet bore no similarity to any known form of human communication. Some marks appeared to be mathematical in nature, showing geometric relationships and numerical progressions that suggested advanced knowledge of abstract concepts. Others resembled anatomical diagrams or astronomical charts, depicting relationships between celestial bodies or biological systems with accuracy that exceeded the educational level of anyone in the mountain community. When Rose finally spoke, her voice carried an otherworldly quality that made the assembled congregation instinctively step back from her small form. The sweet, childish tones that had once risen in innocent hymns of praise were now underscored by harmonics that seemed to come from depths that exceeded the physical capacity of human vocal cords. Her speech patterns had changed as well, incorporating vocabulary and grammatical structures that were far more sophisticated than her previous level of communication. The language she used was recognizably English, yet enhanced with archaic terms and formal constructions that suggested exposure to linguistic forms that predated contemporary usage. Her pronunciation was perfect, each syllable articulated with precision that would have impressed trained orators, while her vocabulary included theological and philosophical concepts that should have been beyond the comprehension of an 8-year-old mountain child. Her first words, spoken in the hushed interior of Whitlock Chapel, while her mother wept and reached toward her with trembling hands, described experiences that challenged the very foundations of Christian doctrine about death and the afterlife. The description was delivered with the calm certainty of someone recounting a journey through familiar countryside. Yet the content was so disturbing that several congregation members fled the chapel rather than hear more of her testimony. I have seen the place where the wicked go when their earthly forms fail them, Rose announced in her transformed voice, her dark eyes fixed on some vision that remained invisible to those around her. I have walked through corridors of fire where the screams of the damned echo for all eternity, and I have witnessed torments that exceed the capacity of human imagination to comprehend or human language to describe adequately. The detailed geography of damnation that Rose began to describe exceeded anything in traditional Christian theology or frontier religious understanding. She spoke of hell not as a single location of punishment, but as a vast realm containing multiple regions specifically designed for different categories of sin. Her descriptions included precise measurements, architectural details, and organizational structures that suggested personal observation rather than theological speculation or childhood imagination. The realm of the damned is organized like a great city built within the earth, Rose continued in her unnaturally mature voice. Its gates are guarded by beings whose wings span distances that would take days to traverse, whose eyes burn with fires that never consume, and whose voices can shatter stone with the sound of divine judgment rendered into eternal condemnation. The walls are built from stones that weep blood, and the foundations rest upon the bones of those who chose rebellion over obedience during their mortal existence. Reverend Whitlock, despite his shock at witnessing what could only be described as resurrection, recognized the theological significance of receiving first-hand testimony about the afterlife from someone who had actually experienced death and returned. With hands that trembled from a combination of fear and religious awe, he began recording Rose's words in the church ledger, understanding that he was documenting something that would either revolutionize Christian understanding of eternal punishment or expose him as the chronicler of elaborate deception. The preacher's theological training had prepared him to approach extraordinary religious claims with appropriate caution. Yet the evidence before him challenged his scholarly skepticism in ways that forced him to consider possibilities that exceeded conventional understanding. Rose's knowledge of religious concepts, her sophisticated use of theological terminology, and most convincingly, her ability to provide specific details about spiritual realities that could not have been learned through normal human experience, suggested that her testimony deserved serious consideration despite its disturbing implications. The child described her initial experience of death as being dragged downward through layers of earth and stone by creatures with coal-black wings and claws like sharpened iron, beings that communicated through sounds that resembled both human speech and the roaring of furnaces consuming everything fed to their flames. These demons, as Rose identified them, had pulled her consciousness through passages that descended far beneath the physical world into realms where different laws governed existence and where suffering could be prolonged indefinitely without the mercy of unconsciousness or final dissolution. The demons who serve as guards and guides in that terrible realm are organized according to hierarchies that reflect the nature of the sins they punish. Rose explained with the precision of someone describing a well-understood bureaucratic system. Those who torment murderers are themselves beings who have perfected the art of killing, while those who punish thieves are creatures who have learned to steal not just material possessions, but hope, joy, and even memory itself from their victims. The geography of damnation that Rose described with the precise detail of someone recounting a journey through familiar countryside included multiple levels of punishment, organized according to the specific sins that had condemned souls to eternal torment. She spoke of chambers where those guilty of pride were forced to carry crushing weights that grew heavier with each step of an endless march. while in adjacent caverns, the envious were forced to watch eternal displays of everything they had coveted in life while being prevented from possessing any of it. The organizational structure of hell, according to Rose's testimony, was administered by demonic officials who had been assigned specific responsibilities based on their own experiences with particular forms of sin and rebellion. She could recite the names and titles of dozens of these supernatural bureaucrats, describing their appearances and duties with the familiarity of someone who had toured their facilities and observed their administrative procedures firsthand. Belphegor oversees the punishment of those who died in sloth, forcing them to engage in labor so intense that their spiritual bodies are constantly destroyed and reformed to begin the torment anew, Rose recited with matter-of-fact precision. Mammon administers the tortures reserved for those who worshipped wealth, compelling them to consume molten gold that burns their throats and stomachs before being expelled to begin the feeding cycle again. Most disturbing to the assembled congregation was Rose's description of recognizing faces among the damned, people from their own community and region who had died in previous years and whose spiritual condition had apparently been revealed through her supernatural journey. She identified by name several individuals who had been considered respectable members of frontier society, describing their current conditions in hell with details that could only have come from direct observation. Old Thomas Brennan is chained in a lake of fire where the flames never consume his flesh, but burn with constant agony, Rose reported in her unnaturally mature voice. He weeps for the Indians he murdered for their land, but his tears only feed the fires that torture him. The demons mock his suffering by showing him visions of the families he destroyed, forcing him to experience their terror and pain as though it were his own. The accuracy of Rose's revelations about the secret sins of deceased community members created panic among the living congregation, who realized that the child's supernatural knowledge might extend to their own hidden transgressions. Her descriptions included private details about the deceased individuals' lives that had been known only to their immediate families or confessors. Information that could not have been obtained through conventional means or childhood eavesdropping. Sarah Mackenzie, who died in childbirth last winter, screams in a pit where demons force her to birth creature after creature, each one more monstrous than the last, Rose continued with chilling precision. This is her punishment for killing her first child rather than face the shame of bearing a bastard. The demons use her maternal instincts against her, making her love each hideous offspring before tearing it away to begin the cycle of birth and loss again. Several families fled the chapel before Rose's testimony concluded, unwilling to risk having their private guilt exposed by a child who had gained the terrible ability to see the spiritual condition of every soul around her. The mass exodus created chaos in the small building as people pushed toward the exits, some weeping, others praying desperately, all recognizing that they were in the presence of knowledge too terrible for human comfort or consolation. Dr. Crawford's continued examination revealed additional evidence that Rose's resurrection had fundamentally altered her physical and mental capabilities. Her cognitive development appeared to have advanced by years during her brief period of death, with her vocabulary and conceptual understanding now exceeding what should have been possible for an 8-year-old child. More significantly, she demonstrated knowledge of languages that she had never been taught, speaking fluently in what the doctor's limited education identified as possibly Latin or Hebrew. The linguistic abilities that Rose displayed during her testimony suggested exposure to educational resources that were impossible for a frontier child to have accessed. Her pronunciation of foreign words was perfect, her grammar was sophisticated, and her use of technical terminology from theology, medicine, and philosophy exceeded the knowledge of most educated adults in the region. When questioned about how she had acquired this knowledge, Rose explained that the information had been transferred to her during her journey through the spiritual realm. Knowledge in that place is not learned through study, but absorbed through experience. Rose explained when questioned about her expanded capabilities. The demons who guided me through their domain shared their understanding because they wanted me to return with accurate information about the consequences of sin. They desire that the living should know exactly what awaits those who choose rebellion over obedience to divine will. The burn marks on Rose's body continued to change and shift during the hours following her resurrection, with new symbols appearing while others faded or transformed into different configurations. Dr. Crawford documented these changes with the meticulous care of a scientist recording unprecedented phenomena, creating detailed drawings of the symbols and noting their evolution over time. The patterns seemed to respond to Rose's emotional state and the content of her testimony, glowing more brightly when she described particularly disturbing aspects of her supernatural experience. The most complex symbols appeared to be related to Rose's prophetic abilities, which became apparent during the first hours after her resurrection. She began making statements about the spiritual condition of living individuals that revealed knowledge of private sins and future consequences that should have been impossible for her to possess. These prophecies were delivered with the same matter-of-fact precision that characterized her descriptions of hell, yet they pertained to events and spiritual states that could potentially be verified through future observation. Elder Morrison, your soul bears stains from the money you stole from the church building fund, Rose observed matter-of-factly as the elderly church leader approached her coffin. The demons are already preparing a place for you in the caverns, where thieves are forced to eat molten gold until their stomachs burst, and then the process begins again for all. The psychological impact of Rose's testimony on the mountain community was immediate and devastating. People who had considered themselves faithful Christians discovered that their private compromises and hidden sins had been observed and recorded by supernatural authorities who would judge them according to standards that exceeded their comfortable assumptions about divine mercy and forgiveness. The realization that hell was not merely a theological concept, but a literal destination described by someone who had visited it created levels of spiritual anxiety that the community had never experienced. Martha Harper, Rose's mother, found herself torn between overwhelming joy at her daughter's return and growing horror at what she had become during her journey through death. The child who embraced her was physically Rose, yet her personality and knowledge had been transformed in ways that challenged Martha's understanding of human nature and divine intervention. She struggled to reconcile her prayers for her daughter's return with the reality of what those prayers had brought back from the realm of the dead. As word of Rose's resurrection and prophetic abilities spread throughout the Ozark region, Whitlock Chapel became a destination for people seeking to hear testimony about the afterlife from someone who had experienced it firsthand. But many who came hoping for reassurance about their spiritual condition left in terror after hearing Rose's pronouncements about their eternal destiny, creating a crisis of faith that challenged the comfortable assumptions about salvation and damnation that had characterized frontier Christianity. Reverend Whitlock found himself struggling to provide pastoral guidance to a community that was being torn apart by revelations from a child whose resurrection had apparently given her access to knowledge that exceeded human understanding and perhaps human capacity to accept. The simple mountain faith that had sustained his congregation through the hardships of frontier life was being challenged by supernatural evidence that suggested the reality of eternal punishment was far more terrible than their theological understanding had prepared them to face. The crisis deepened when Rose began demonstrating additional supernatural abilities that confirmed her transformation from normal child into something that existed between the human and spiritual realms. She could see in complete darkness, hear conversations taking place at impossible distances, and most disturbing of all, predict future events with accuracy that exceeded coincidence or natural insight. These abilities suggested that her resurrection had not simply restored her to life, but had fundamentally altered her nature in ways that made her more than human, while perhaps making her less than fully alive. In the weeks following Rose Harper's resurrection, the isolated mountain community of Whitlock's Crossing became the epicenter of a spiritual crisis that divided families, shattered long-held beliefs, and transformed an 8-year-old girl into the most feared and sought-after prophet in the entire Ozark region. Rose's supernatural abilities continued to intensify with each passing day, revealing not only her capacity to see the spiritual condition of every person she encountered, but also her ability to predict their ultimate fate with terrifying accuracy that defied rational explanation and challenged the very foundations of Christian doctrine about redemption and salvation. The physical changes in Rose became more pronounced as her prophetic abilities developed. Her body seemed to be adapting to serve as a conduit between the physical and spiritual realms, developing characteristics that enabled her to perceive and communicate supernatural information with increasing clarity and precision. Her eyes, already transformed by her journey through death, began to reflect light in ways that seemed impossible according to normal human physiology, sometimes appearing to glow with their own internal illumination. When she was experiencing particularly intense prophetic visions, Martha Harper found herself trapped between overwhelming joy at her daughter's return from death and growing horror at what Rose had become. During her journey through the afterlife, the child who had once helped her mother with household chores and delighted in picking wildflowers from the mountain meadows now spent her days sitting motionless for hours, her dark eyes fixed on visions that remained invisible to everyone else, while she spoke in languages that predated human civilization and described torments that exceeded the capacity of mortal imagination to comprehend. The transformation extended beyond Rose's physical appearance to encompass fundamental changes in her personality and behavior patterns. The sweet, playful child who had been beloved by the entire community had been replaced by a serious, otherworldly being whose interactions with family and neighbors were marked by emotional detachment and analytical distance that suggested her personality had been fundamentally altered by exposure to supernatural realities that exceeded human capacity to integrate into normal psychological functioning. Rose's daily routine had become completely unlike that of any normal child. She required no sleep, remaining alert and responsive throughout day and night cycles without showing signs of fatigue or the need for rest. Her body seemed to draw energy from sources beyond normal physiological processes, as though her resurrection had connected her to supernatural power supplies that sustained her existence according to different rules than those governing ordinary human biology. Food held no appeal for her, and when she did consume small amounts of bread or milk at her mother's insistence, the nourishment seemed to provide no benefit to her transformed physiology. She would accept a few bites to reassure her mother, but it was clear that her body no longer required conventional sustenance to maintain its functions. Dr. Crawford theorized that her supernatural transformation had altered her metabolic processes to draw energy directly from spiritual sources rather than from physical consumption. The physical changes in Rose continued to manifest in ways that the elders' concerns were shared by other community leaders who had observed the psychological effects of Rose's prophecies on their neighbors and family members. Instead of inspiring people to greater faithfulness and moral behavior, her revelations seemed to be creating panic, depression, and in some cases, a fatalistic acceptance of damnation that led to increased rather than decreased sinful behavior. Some people concluded that if their fate was already sealed, there was no point in attempting to live righteously. But Rose's supporters, led by families who had witnessed the accuracy of her predictions and the undeniable supernatural nature of her abilities, argued that dismissing her testimony would mean rejecting evidence of divine revelation that could help the community avoid the eternal torments she described in such vivid detail. They pointed to specific instances where Rose's prophecies had been fulfilled with precision that exceeded coincidence or natural insight, demonstrating that her knowledge derived from supernatural sources that demanded serious consideration. The most compelling evidence for Rose's supernatural abilities came from her accurate predictions of future events, particularly deaths within the community that she foretold with disturbing precision. She had correctly predicted not only when specific individuals would die, but also the exact circumstances of their passing and their ultimate spiritual destination, based on their condition at the time of death. These prophecies were delivered with the same matter-of-fact precision that characterized all of her supernatural pronouncements. When Rose prophesied that Jeremiah Collins would die within 7 days from injuries sustained in a logging accident, and that his soul would be consigned to torment because of his unrepented adultery, the community initially dismissed her words as the product of a disturbed imagination influenced by her traumatic death experience. Collins was a strong, healthy man in his prime who had worked in the timber industry for over a decade without serious injury, making the prediction seem unlikely on practical grounds. But when Collins was indeed killed, exactly as Rose had described, crushed beneath a falling tree while working in the remote timber tract where he had arranged secret meetings with his neighbor's wife, even skeptics were forced to acknowledge that her prophetic abilities transcended normal human capabilities. The accuracy of the prediction was so precise that it included details about the specific tree that would fall, the time of day when the accident would occur, and even the final words that Collins would speak before his death. The accuracy of Rose's death prophecies created a climate of terror throughout the region, as people realized that hearing their fate pronounced by a child who had walked in the realm of the damned might be the last warning they would receive about the eternal consequences of their actions. Some community members fled their homes rather than risk encountering Rose and learning that their sins had already sealed their eternal destiny, while others sought her out desperately, hoping to receive assurance of salvation that she seemed unable or unwilling to provide. The predictions proved accurate in every detail. Collins spoke his final words exactly as Rose had foretold. "Tell my wife I'm sorry for what I'd done," before the massive oak crashed down upon him with force that crushed his body beyond recognition. The location, timing, and circumstances of his death matched Rose's prophecy so precisely that even Elder Morse was forced to acknowledge that her abilities transcended normal human capabilities, though he maintained that supernatural accuracy did not necessarily prove divine origin. Other death predictions followed with the same disturbing precision. When Rose announced that widow Mary Kensington would die within 2 weeks from a fall down her cabin steps, breaking her neck at precisely noon on a Tuesday, skeptics began counting the days. Mrs. Kensington, aware of the prophecy, took extraordinary precautions to avoid her predicted fate, refusing to leave her cabin and asking neighbors to bring her supplies rather than risk the steps that Rose had identified as the instrument of her death. But prophecy, once spoken by Rose's transformed lips, seemed to carry the weight of inevitability. On the predicted Tuesday, Mrs. Kensington's cabin caught fire from an overturned oil lamp, forcing her to flee through her front door. In her panic and desperation to escape the flames, she stumbled on the very steps she had avoided for 2 weeks, breaking her neck at exactly noon, just as Rose had foretold. The accuracy was so precise that several witnesses checked their pocket watches against the church bell, confirming that Mrs. Kensington had died at the exact moment specified in the prophecy. But Rose's prophecies offered little comfort even to those who considered themselves faithful Christians, as her supernatural knowledge revealed that the standards for salvation were far more demanding than frontier theology had taught. She described meeting in hell numerous individuals who had been considered pillars of their communities, church leaders, and charity workers whose hidden sins had condemned them to eternal punishment despite their public displays of righteousness. The Methodist circuit rider, Jacob Preston, burns in flames that never consume his flesh because he stole money from collection plates across 3 counties, Rose announced during one of her prophetic episodes. His screams echo through the psychological impact of such revelations on the mountain community was devastating, creating levels of spiritual anxiety and terror that exceeded anything in their previous religious experience. Traditional sources of comfort and guidance seemed inadequate when confronted with prophetic testimony that revealed the reality of damnation to be far more extensive and inescapable than anyone had imagined. Samuel Hayes, confronted with Rose's specific knowledge of his private struggles with alcohol and his dreams about his deceased brother, fled the community within days of hearing his prophecy. He was later found dead from exposure in a remote mountain cabin, clutching an empty whiskey bottle and a note that cursed God for allowing such suffering in the world. Rose's prediction had apparently become a self-fulfilling prophecy, demonstrating the power of her words to shape as well as foretell future events. The pattern repeated with other community members who received personal prophecies from Rose. Instead of inspiring them to repentance and spiritual reform, her revelations seemed to create despair and fatalistic acceptance of damnation that led people toward the very sins and behaviors that would ensure their predicted fate. This reverse psychology effect troubled even Rose's supporters, who began to question whether her mission was truly beneficial for the community's spiritual welfare. Reverend Whitlock found his pastoral authority challenged by a child whose supernatural knowledge exceeded his theological training and whose prophetic abilities attracted followers who began to view her as a more reliable source of spiritual guidance than conventional church leadership. His attempts to maintain doctrinal balance and provide hope for redemption were undermined by Rose's relentless emphasis on the inevitability of punishment for the vast majority of human souls. The preacher's own faith was being tested by revelations that challenged his understanding of divine mercy and justice. Rose's descriptions of hell suggested that God's standards for salvation were so demanding that few humans could possibly meet them, contradicting the gospel message of grace and forgiveness that formed the foundation of Christian preaching. The implications of her testimony raised questions about whether evangelism was meaningful if most people were predestined for damnation regardless of their response to the gospel. As Rose's reputation spread beyond the immediate community, pilgrims began arriving from throughout the Ozark region, seeking prophetic guidance about their spiritual condition and eternal destiny. Some came hoping for reassurance about their salvation, while others sought warnings that might help them avoid the damnation that seemed to be the fate of so many souls. But Rose's prophecies rarely provided the comfort that people sought, instead revealing hidden sins and predicting spiritual destinations that created more fear than faith. The influx of visitors created practical problems for the small mountain community, which lacked resources to accommodate large numbers of temporary residents. More significantly, the constant stream of people seeking prophetic guidance transformed Whitlock's Crossing from a quiet settlement into something resembling a religious pilgrimage site. With all the associated disruptions to normal community life, Rose Harper found herself overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for her transformed daughter while managing the crowds of people who sought access to Rose's prophetic abilities. The child who had once been her greatest joy had become a source of constant anxiety and spiritual confusion that challenged every assumption she had made about motherhood, faith, and divine providence. The crisis reached its peak when Rose began speaking in languages that scholars identified as potentially pre-Adamic tongues, ancient forms of communication that allegedly existed before the Tower of Babel divided human language into multiple forms. Her fluency in these supernatural languages suggested that her knowledge derived from sources that predated human civilization and possibly originated in the spiritual realm itself. Dr. Crawford documented Rose's linguistic abilities through careful observation and notation, creating records that would later prove valuable for scientific analysis of her supernatural transformation. The languages she spoke showed characteristics that were unlike any known human communication systems, incorporating tonal variations and grammatical structures that seemed designed for non-human vocal apparatus while remaining somehow comprehensible to human listeners. The ultimate question that haunted the community was whether Rose's supernatural abilities represented divine intervention designed to warn humanity about the reality of eternal punishment, or demonic deception intended to create despair and spiritual paralysis among Christians who might conclude that salvation was impossible to achieve. The evidence supported both interpretations, creating a crisis of faith that divided the community and challenged traditional assumptions about the nature of supernatural revelation. As winter approached and Rose's prophetic abilities continued to intensify, the community prepared for what many believed would be an official church investigation that might provide definitive answers about the nature and origin of her supernatural transformation. The arrival of regional Methodist authorities would test whether Rose's testimony could withstand theological examination and whether her abilities would continue to manifest under official scrutiny. By December 1889, reports of Rose Harper's resurrection and prophetic abilities had reached the regional headquarters of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Springfield, Missouri, prompting an official investigation that would bring together the most qualified theologians, physicians, and spiritual authorities available to examine claims that challenged fundamental doctrines about death, resurrection, and the nature of divine revelation in human affairs. The investigation team, assembled under the direction of District Superintendent Reverend Dr. Matthias Thornton, represented the church's most serious attempt to apply scholarly rigor and scientific methodology to supernatural phenomena that exceeded conventional understanding while potentially validating or refuting theological concepts that formed the foundation of Christian faith. Dr. Matthias Thornton, a graduate of Yale Divinity School, whose theological training had been supplemented by advanced studies in philosophy and comparative religion at European universities, approached the Rose Harper case with the careful balance of scholarly skepticism and religious openness that characterized the most respected theologians of his era. His academic background had prepared him to analyze extraordinary religious claims through multiple interpretative frameworks while maintaining the intellectual honesty necessary to acknowledge evidence that might challenge his preconceptions about the limits of divine intervention in human experience. The district superintendent's reputation within Methodist circles was based on his ability to navigate complex theological controversies while maintaining both doctrinal integrity and pastoral sensitivity to the needs of frontier communities whose religious experiences often exceeded the boundaries of conventional academic theology. His previous work had included investigations of alleged healing miracles, prophetic claims, and other supernatural phenomena reported by Methodist congregations throughout the region, experience that had taught him to distinguish between genuine spiritual manifestations and elaborate deceptions rooted in psychological or social factors. The investigation team assembled under Dr. Thornton's leadership represented an unprecedented concentration of expertise focused on supernatural phenomena, including theologians trained in biblical analysis and church doctrine, physicians equipped with the most advanced medical knowledge available in the 19th century, linguistic scholars capable of analyzing Rose's claimed ability to speak in ancient languages, and what the church termed spiritual investigators, whose specialized training prepared them to evaluate claims of divine or demonic intervention in human affairs. Dr. Marcus Kellerman, the team's chief medical officer, had been selected for his expertise in neurological disorders and psychological conditions that might produce symptoms resembling supernatural phenomena. His medical training at Johns Hopkins University had exposed him to the latest theories about the relationship between brain function and religious experience, while his clinical practice had provided extensive experience with patients who claimed various forms of spiritual or mystical abilities that challenged conventional medical understanding. Professor Wilhelm Steinberg, the expedition's linguistic expert, brought to the investigation specialized knowledge of ancient languages and comparative philology that would prove essential for evaluating Rose's claimed ability to speak in pre-biblical tongues. His academic work had focused on the development of human language systems and their relationship to religious and mystical traditions, making him uniquely qualified to assess whether Rose's linguistic abilities represented genuine supernatural knowledge or elaborate psychological phenomena. The team also included Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mitchell, a specialist in theological analysis of prophetic claims, whose previous work had involved examining alleged revelations and supernatural communications reported by various religious groups throughout the American frontier. His expertise in distinguishing between authentic spiritual manifestations and deceptive or psychologically generated phenomena would prove crucial for determining the ultimate source and significance of Rose's abilities. The investigation began with comprehensive examination of all existing documentation related to Rose's case, including Reverend Whitlock's meticulous records of her testimony, Dr. Crawford's medical observations, and witness statements from community members who had observed her resurrection and subsequent prophetic activities. This documentary review revealed a level of detail and consistency that impressed the academic investigators while raising questions about how such extensive supernatural phenomena could be sustained over extended periods without detection of fraud or deception. Dr. Thornton's initial interviews with key witnesses established the credibility of the primary sources while confirming that Rose's abilities had been observed by multiple independent witnesses whose testimony could not be easily dismissed as group hysteria or shared delusion. The convergence of testimony from people with different backgrounds, perspectives, and potential motivations provided strong evidence that genuine supernatural phenomena were occurring. Regardless of their ultimate source or significance, the medical examination of Rose herself provided the most dramatic evidence for the reality of her supernatural transformation. Dr. Kellerman's comprehensive physical assessment revealed physiological characteristics that defied conventional medical explanation, while confirming that her resurrection had fundamentally altered her biological processes in ways that exceeded anything in contemporary scientific literature. Rose's body temperature remained consistently several degrees below normal human ranges, yet she showed no signs of hypothermia, circulatory problems, or the metabolic dysfunction that should have accompanied such readings. Her cardiovascular system functioned according to patterns that suggested adaptation to different physiological requirements, with heart rate and blood pressure readings that fell outside normal human parameters while apparently maintaining adequate circulation and oxygenation. Most significantly, Dr. Kellerman's examination confirmed that the burn marks covering Rose's body had been created through processes that exceeded natural explanation. The patterns showed characteristics indicating that they had been formed from within her body rather than applied externally, with cellular damage and healing patterns that suggested supernatural rather than conventional causation. The marks continued to change and evolve during the examination process, with new configurations appearing while others faded according to principles that seemed related to Rose's prophetic activities. The burn marks themselves defied medical classification, showing characteristics that resembled both ancient scarification techniques and modern electrical burns, while displaying healing properties that exceeded normal human regenerative capabilities. The patterns appeared to be organized according to systematic principles that suggested conscious design rather than random occurrence, with geometric relationships and symbolic elements that implied meaningful communication rather than arbitrary scarring. Chemical analysis of tissue samples from the burn marks revealed cellular structures that had been altered at the molecular level through processes that contemporary science could not identify or replicate. The affected cells showed enhanced durability and regenerative properties while maintaining their essential biological functions, suggesting that Rose's supernatural transformation had optimized her physical systems for purposes that exceeded normal human requirements. The linguistic examination of Rose's supernatural abilities provided equally compelling evidence for the reality of her transformation. Professor Steinberg's detailed analysis confirmed that she spoke fluently in languages that included Classical Hebrew, Aramaic, Ancient Greek, and what appeared to be pre-biblical forms of communication that existed only in the most ancient religious manuscripts and archaeological inscriptions. Rose's pronunciation and grammar in these ancient languages showed accuracy that exceeded the knowledge of trained scholars who had devoted decades to studying such linguistic systems. Her vocabulary included technical terms and specialized concepts that were known only to the most advanced academic researchers, while her fluency suggested native speaker competence that could not have been acquired through conventional educational processes. Most remarkably, Rose demonstrated knowledge of linguistic variations and dialectical subtleties that had been discovered only through recent archaeological research that was not available to the general public. Her use of specific grammatical constructions and pronunciation patterns matched newly discovered ancient texts that had not yet been published in academic journals, suggesting that her knowledge derived from sources that exceeded contemporary scholarly understanding. The theological examination of Rose's testimony created the most serious challenges for the investigation team, as her descriptions of hell contradicted established Methodist doctrine in ways that could not be reconciled through conventional interpretation of Scripture. Her detailed accounts of the afterlife suggested that divine judgment was far more severe and inescapable than mainstream Protestant theology taught, challenging fundamental beliefs about redemption and salvation that form the foundation of Christian hope and evangelistic efforts. Rose's knowledge of biblical texts and theological concepts proved extensive and sophisticated, with her interpretations of scriptural passages often providing insights that exceeded the understanding of trained theologians. Her analysis of prophetic literature, eschatological themes, and soteriological questions demonstrated familiarity with advanced theological concepts that should have been beyond the comprehension of an 8-year-old frontier child, regardless of her religious upbringing. But the content of Rose's revelations raised disturbing questions about the nature of divine justice and the possibility of salvation that challenged core Methodist teachings about grace, redemption, and the universal availability of divine mercy. Her emphasis on the inevitability of damnation for the majority of human souls contradicted evangelical assumptions about the effectiveness of preaching and the possibility of conversion, suggesting either that traditional Christian theology was fundamentally flawed or that Rose's revelations derived from sources other than divine inspiration. The investigation team's attempts to challenge or disprove Rose's claims were consistently frustrated by the accuracy of her prophetic statements and the verifiable nature of her supernatural knowledge. Tests designed to expose fraud or delusion instead provided additional evidence that her abilities derived from sources beyond normal human experience and exceeded anything that contemporary science or theology could adequately explain. When committee members attempted to trick Rose by providing false information about their personal histories or testing her prophetic abilities with deliberately misleading questions, she responded with corrections that revealed their deceptions while providing accurate information about their actual backgrounds and spiritual conditions that could not have been obtained through natural investigation or conventional intelligence gathering. Dr. Thornton, your father Jonathan stands in a lake of burning sulfur because he defrauded widows of their property through legal manipulations that enriched him while leaving them destitute, Rose announced during the formal examination session. Despite the fact that Dr. Thornton had never publicly discussed his father's business practices or the circumstances of his death, he begged me to tell you that his earthly success was purchased with his eternal soul, and that the wealth he accumulated now serves only to fuel the flames that torment him without end. The accuracy of such revelations, which included private family information that had never been shared outside immediate circles and details about deceased individuals that could not have been verified through conventional research, forced the investigation team to acknowledge that Rose possessed knowledge that exceeded natural human capabilities and suggested supernatural sources that could not be dismissed through conventional scholarly analysis. Professor Steinberg's linguistic analysis revealed that Rose's use of ancient languages included knowledge of textual variations and manuscript traditions that had been discovered only through recent archaeological excavations in the Middle East. Her familiarity with specific dialectical forms and grammatical constructions matched newly discovered inscriptions that had not yet been translated or published, suggesting access to information that preceded contemporary scholarly understanding by centuries or millennia. The psychological examination of Rose revealed cognitive development that far exceeded normal childhood parameters, with her intellectual abilities now functioning at adult levels despite her chronological age of 8 years. Dr. Agnes Hartwell, one of the few female physicians practicing in the region and a specialist in child development, conducted detailed assessments that revealed Rose's mental capabilities had been fundamentally altered by her death experience in ways that challenged understanding of human consciousness and developmental processes. Rose's memory capabilities exceeded anything in contemporary psychological literature, with perfect recall of complex information and the ability to cross-reference details from different sources with accuracy that suggested access to enhanced cognitive processing systems. Her analytical abilities allowed her to synthesize information from multiple disciplines while identifying patterns and relationships that eluded trained specialists, demonstrating intellectual capabilities that exceeded those of university-educated adults. Most disturbing was Rose's apparent inability to experience normal human emotions or maintain the social connections that characterized healthy childhood development. Her interactions with family members and community leaders showed detachment and analytical distance that suggested her personality had been fundamentally altered by exposure to supernatural realities that exceeded human capacity to integrate into normal psychological functioning. The investigation team's final phase involved attempts to determine whether Rose's experiences could be explained through demonic deception rather than genuine divine revelation. The theological examination focused on whether her testimony aligned with established Christian doctrine or contradicted fundamental beliefs about God's character and the nature of salvation in ways that suggested satanic influence, designed to promote despair and spiritual destruction among Christian believers. But Rose's knowledge of scripture and theological principles proved extensive and accurate, with her interpretations of biblical passages often providing insights that exceeded the scholarly understanding of trained theologians. Her emphasis on divine justice and the reality of eternal punishment, while disturbing, aligned with biblical teaching about judgment and condemnation, in ways that could not be dismissed as heretical or contrary to Christian revelation. The investigation team's final report, submitted to Methodist Episcopal Church leadership in February 1890, documented their conclusion that Rose Harper's resurrection and prophetic abilities represented genuine supernatural phenomena that exceeded natural explanation while challenging established theological understanding of divine revelation and human experience of the afterlife. Their findings confirmed that Rose's abilities were real and continuing, but raised questions about their ultimate source and purpose that contemporary Christian scholarship was inadequately prepared to address. But the most significant outcome of the official investigation was the decision to classify Rose's testimony and the associated documentation as sensitive material that should be restricted from general circulation to prevent the widespread panic and spiritual disruption that unrestricted access to such disturbing revelations might cause among Christian communities unprepared to confront evidence that the reality of eternal punishment exceeded their theological understanding and spiritual preparation. The classification decision reflected the investigation team's recognition that Rose's revelations, while possibly genuine, posed threats to public spiritual welfare that outweighed potential benefits of scholarly study or evangelistic application. The detailed descriptions of hell's organization and the inevitability of damnation for most human souls were judged likely to create despair and spiritual paralysis, rather than inspiring repentance and religious commitment among general Christian populations. Dr. Thornton's final recommendation called for continued private study of Rose's case while maintaining strict controls over public access to her testimony, acknowledging that her supernatural abilities represented unprecedented phenomena that required careful analysis while protecting the church and general public from psychological trauma that widespread knowledge of her revelations might produce. The investigation's conclusion marked the beginning of an institutional cover-up that would persist for over a century, with church authorities maintaining official silence about Rose's case while preserving detailed documentation for potential future study when theological understanding might be better prepared to address the implications of her supernatural testimony about the nature of death, judgment, and eternal punishment in the cosmic order. In the climate-controlled depths of the Hendricks College Methodist Historical Archives in Conway, Arkansas, where thousands of documents chronicling the religious heritage of American frontier communities rested in protective storage designed to preserve fragile materials for future generations of scholars. Dr. Sarah Mitchell carefully turned the yellowed pages of a leather-bound ledger that had been sealed from public access for over 130 years. The document before her represented one of the most thoroughly documented cases of alleged supernatural intervention in American religious history. Yet it had been systematically suppressed by church authorities who concluded that its revelations posed threats to public spiritual welfare that outweighed any potential benefits of scholarly investigation or theological study. Dr. Mitchell, whose academic specialization in American frontier religious history had earned her recognition as one of the foremost experts in 19th century Methodist missions and revival movements, had spent 3 years petitioning various denominational archives and historical societies for access to classified materials that appeared in footnotes and bibliographic references, but were consistently denied to researchers seeking comprehensive understanding of supernatural phenomena reported by frontier religious communities. Her persistence had finally been rewarded through a combination of genealogical connections and administrative changes that made previously restricted materials available for limited scholarly examination. The breakthrough in her research had come through family genealogical investigation that revealed her great-great-grandmother had been Martha Harper, Rose's mother, establishing a direct family connection to the events documented in the Forbidden Archives. This genealogical link combined with Dr. Mitchell's established scholarly credentials and her ability to demonstrate legitimate academic purposes for accessing sensitive historical materials, had finally persuaded church officials to grant restricted access under conditions that severely limited how the information could be used or published. Family, oral traditions preserved in Dr. Mitchell's own background had maintained fragmentary accounts of Rose Harper's resurrection and prophetic abilities that aligned remarkably well with the official documentation now spread before her on the archive's climate-controlled examination table. Stories passed down through 5 generations of family memory had preserved details about Rose's supernatural transformation that matched the contemporary records kept by Reverend Whitlock and the Methodist investigation team, providing independent confirmation of events that challenged conventional understanding of human experience and divine intervention. The centerpiece of the archived materials was Reverend Josiah Whitlock's meticulous chronicle of Rose's testimony, recorded in handwriting that remained remarkably clear and legible despite the passage of more than a century. The frontier preacher's documentation included not only complete transcripts of Rose's prophetic statements, but also detailed observations about her physical condition, behavioral changes, and the community's response to her supernatural abilities throughout the months following her resurrection from clinical death. Whitlock's records demonstrated scholarly thoroughness that exceeded what might have been expected from a frontier minister whose formal education had been limited compared to university-trained theologians. His careful attention to chronological detail, his systematic documentation of physical evidence, and his meticulous recording of witness testimony revealed an understanding of the historical significance of the events he was documenting and his determination to create an accurate record for future analysis by qualified authorities. The preacher's personal commentary, interspersed throughout his factual documentation, revealed the profound impact that Rose's transformation had on his own faith and theological understanding. His struggle to reconcile her disturbing revelations with traditional Christian doctrine was evident in marginalia and reflective passages that showed an intelligent man grappling with evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about divine mercy, human salvation, and the nature of eternal judgment. But what emerged from Dr. Mitchell's examination of the complete archives was evidence that Rose Harper's case represented not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of similar occurrences that had been systematically documented and suppressed by religious authorities throughout American history. Cross-references in the Methodist files led to additional sealed cases involving children who had died and returned with prophetic abilities and supernatural knowledge that challenged established theological understanding in ways that church leadership had deemed too dangerous for public circulation. The pattern that Dr. Mitchell identified included documented cases dating back to colonial times, with instances of child resurrection and prophetic testimony appearing in Puritan records from Massachusetts, Presbyterian archives from Pennsylvania, Baptist documents from the Carolinas, and Catholic files from Spanish colonial territories. Each case involved children between the ages of 6 and 12 who had died from illness or accident, remained clinically deceased for periods of 2 to 5 days, and returned with abilities that included prophetic vision, supernatural knowledge of hidden sins, and detailed descriptions of the afterlife that exceeded their previous education or cultural exposure. The consistency of these cases across different time periods, geographical regions, and denominational backgrounds was striking enough to suggest either remarkable cultural transmission of afterlife imagery through American religious communities or genuine supernatural experiences that transcended individual imagination, psychological suggestion, or religious instruction. The children's accounts showed remarkable similarity in their descriptions of hell's organization, the systematic nature of eternal punishment, and the specific details of afterlife, geography that would have been impossible to coordinate through conventional communication, or shared cultural knowledge. Dr. Mitchell's analysis of photographic evidence from Rose Harper's case, preserved in the archives since the 1890 investigation, revealed burn marks whose patterns matched newly discovered archaeological symbols from pre-Christian religious sites throughout the Mediterranean region, Mesopotamia, and other areas where ancient civilizations had developed complex religious systems that included detailed conceptions of afterlife judgment and punishment. The alignment between Rose's physical markings and these archaeological discoveries was so precise that coincidence seemed impossible, suggesting genuine contact with spiritual realities that predated established Christian revelation by millennia. Computer analysis of the photographic evidence, conducted using digital enhancement techniques unavailable to 19th century investigators, revealed additional layers of complexity in the burn mark patterns that had not been visible to contemporary observers. The symbols showed mathematical relationships and geometric progressions that reflected advanced understanding of numerical concepts and spatial relationships that exceeded the educational level of anyone in Rose's frontier community, while matching principles found in ancient mystical and religious texts. The long-term follow-up documentation proved most disturbing for Dr. Mitchell's understanding of Rose's ultimate fate and the implications of her supernatural transformation for contemporary understanding of human consciousness, spiritual reality, and the boundaries between life and death. Church records indicated that Rose had continued to manifest prophetic abilities throughout an extended lifetime that appeared to have been supernaturally prolonged beyond normal human parameters through processes that defied biological explanation. Photographs from different decades showed that Rose aged extremely slowly, maintaining the physical appearance of a 12-year-old child well into the 20th century, despite being chronologically decades older. Medical examinations conducted by various physicians throughout her extended lifetime confirmed that her physical development had been arrested at the point of her resurrection, with her body remaining in a state of suspended biological time that allowed her to retain childlike features while accumulating decades of supernatural experience and prophetic knowledge that exceeded anything in normal human development patterns. Rose's final documented appearance occurred in 1954, when she was photographed at a Methodist camp meeting in Missouri at the apparent physical age of 12, despite being chronologically 73 years old. Church officials noted that her prophetic abilities remained unchanged throughout the decades, continuing to provide accurate predictions about community members' deaths and spiritual destinations, while maintaining her detailed knowledge of hell's geography and administration, with the same precision that had characterized her initial testimony in 1889. The circumstances of Rose's final disappearance remained mysterious and unexplained, with witnesses reporting that she simply vanished during a prophetic episode without leaving any trace of where she might have gone or what might have happened to her physical form. Some accounts suggested that she had been recalled to the spiritual realm that had originally sent her back to provide testimony about eternal punishment, while others theorized that her extended mission among the living had finally concluded, and she had been allowed to proceed to whatever ultimate destination awaited those who had served as messengers between the worlds of mortality and eternity. Dr. Mitchell's investigation revealed that the systematic suppression of Rose's case and similar incidents reflected official church concern that widespread knowledge of such extreme depictions of eternal punishment would create mass psychological trauma and undermine the evangelistic emphasis on divine mercy and redemption that characterized mainstream Protestant theology throughout the 20th century. Church leaders had concluded that evidence of resurrection and prophetic testimony, while potentially genuine, posed threats to public spiritual welfare that justified official concealment and restricted access to documented materials. The archived correspondence between regional church officials revealed extensive debates about whether Rose's testimony represented divine revelation intended to warn humanity about the reality of eternal punishment or demonic deception designed to promote despair and spiritual paralysis among Christians who might conclude that salvation was impossible to achieve given the demanding standards she described. The ultimate decision to classify her case reflected compromise positions that acknowledged the supernatural nature of her abilities, while restricting access to her more disturbing revelations to prevent widespread religious panic. Modern analysis of Rose's linguistic abilities, conducted by Dr. Mitchell in consultation with contemporary scholars of ancient languages and computer-assisted translation systems, confirmed that her fluency in pre-biblical tongues represented knowledge that exceeded any possible natural acquisition through conventional educational processes. Advanced computational analysis of her recorded speech patterns revealed grammatical structures and vocabulary that aligned with the most ancient religious texts, while including elements that appeared to be genuinely prehistoric in origin, predating known human linguistic development by millennia. The theological implications of Rose's case continued to challenge established Christian doctrine about resurrection, prophecy, and the nature of divine revelation in ways that contemporary church leadership remained unprepared to address publicly or integrate into mainstream denominational teaching. Detailed descriptions of hell's organization and administration suggested that eternal punishment was far more systematic and extensive than mainstream Protestant theology taught, while her prophetic accuracy indicated that divine foreknowledge extended to individual spiritual destinies in ways that challenged beliefs about free will and redemption that form the foundation of evangelical preaching and missionary activity. Computer-enhanced analysis of the photographic evidence from Rose's case revealed previously undetected layers of complexity in the burn mark patterns that covered her body throughout her extended lifetime. Digital enhancement techniques unavailable to 19th century investigators showed that the symbols contained mathematical relationships, astronomical alignments, and geometric progressions that reflected advanced understanding of physical laws and cosmic relationships that exceeded the scientific knowledge of her era by decades or centuries. The patterns appeared to represent some form of supernatural communication system that encoded information about spiritual realities and cosmic relationships in visual symbols that could be preserved and transmitted through physical manifestation on human tissue. The precision and complexity of the encoding suggested intelligence and purpose that exceeded human capabilities, while providing evidence for systematic supernatural intervention in human affairs that challenged naturalistic assumptions about the boundaries between spiritual and physical reality. Dr. Mitchell's analysis of similar cases throughout American religious history revealed that the pattern of child resurrection and prophetic testimony was not limited to Christian communities, but appeared in various forms across different religious and cultural traditions throughout North American frontier development. Native American tribal records contained accounts of children who died and returned with knowledge of the spirit world that exceeded their previous cultural exposure, while Jewish, Catholic, and various Protestant denominational archives all contained documented cases that showed remarkable consistency in their basic characteristics, despite significant differences in theological interpretation and institutional response. The cross-cultural consistency of these phenomena suggested either remarkable cultural transmission of afterlife, imagery across different religious traditions, or genuine supernatural experiences that transcended individual religious frameworks and represented universal aspects of human encounter with spiritual reality. The children's descriptions of afterlife geography, punishment systems, and spiritual hierarchies showed similarities that could not be explained through conventional cultural influence or shared religious education, pointing toward either common psychological mechanisms or genuine contact with spiritual realms that existed independently of human religious construction. Dr. Mitchell's final report, submitted to the Methodist Historical Society in 2019, recommended continued restriction of public access to the Rose Harper archives while acknowledging that her case represented one of the most thoroughly documented instances of alleged supernatural intervention in American religious history. The evidence suggested that some form of genuine otherworldly contact had occurred, but the implications were considered too disturbing to risk widespread circulation among contemporary religious communities that might be unprepared to integrate such challenging revelations into their existing theological frameworks. The recommendation for continued classification reflected ongoing institutional concern that Rose's testimony about the extensive nature of eternal punishment and the demanding standards for avoiding damnation could create the same psychological and spiritual disruption in modern Christian communities that had characterized the initial response to her revelations in 1889. Church leaders remained convinced that protecting public spiritual welfare justified maintaining secrecy about documented evidence of supernatural phenomena that challenged comfortable assumptions about divine mercy and the possibility of salvation. The forbidden archives continue to rest in their climate-controlled storage, preserving testimony about experiences that challenge human understanding of death, resurrection, and eternal judgment while remaining sealed from public examination by scholars or believers who might seek to understand the full implications of one child's journey through death and return with knowledge too terrible for mortal comprehension. Rose Harper's legacy remains hidden in documents that acknowledge the reality of supernatural intervention while protecting humanity from revelations about eternal consequences that exceed our capacity to accept or integrate into conventional religious faith. The question that haunts Dr. Mitchell's ongoing research and her sleepless nights is whether Rose's case represents isolated divine intervention designed to warn humanity about spiritual realities we have ignored or forgotten, or evidence of systematic otherworldly recruitment of witnesses designed to spread knowledge of damnation throughout human civilization, using resurrected children as messengers whose innocence and supernatural abilities make their testimony impossible to dismiss, while ensuring that the terror they inspire will motivate religious compliance through fear rather than love. The implications extend beyond theological speculation into practical considerations about human psychology and social stability. If Rose's revelations about the extensive nature of hell and the demanding standards for salvation are accurate, then the majority of human souls are destined for eternal torment, regardless of their religious beliefs or moral behavior. Such knowledge, if widely accepted, could create societal collapse as people lose hope in the possibility of redemption and abandon efforts to live righteously. Yet, the alternative possibility that supernatural forces are deliberately deceiving humans through false revelations designed to create despair raises equally disturbing questions about the nature of spiritual reality and humanity's vulnerability to forces beyond our understanding or control. Either interpretation suggests that human existence occurs within cosmic circumstances that exceed our comprehension while posing threats to our spiritual and psychological well-being that we are inadequately prepared to address. The Rose Harper archives represent more than historical curiosity or theological speculation. They document a challenge to fundamental human assumptions about the nature of existence, the possibility of life after death, and our relationship to supernatural forces that may be actively involved in human affairs, according to agendas that exceed our understanding. Whether those forces are divine, demonic, or something else entirely, The evidence suggests that they possess capabilities and knowledge that make human wisdom appear childish, while human spiritual preparation seems tragically inadequate for the cosmic realities we may be required to face. As Dr. Mitchell concluded her examination of the forbidden documents and prepared to leave the archives, she carried with her not only academic knowledge about one of the most extraordinary cases in American religious history, but also personal questions about the nature of reality and human destiny that would influence her own spiritual journey for the remainder of her life. The child who had died and returned with terrible knowledge about eternal punishment had reached across more than a century to challenge another generation's assumptions about life, death, and the cosmic forces that may determine the ultimate fate of every human soul. The archives were resealed, the documents returned to their protective storage, and official silence maintained about revelations the church authorities continued to believe posed too great a threat to public spiritual welfare to risk widespread circulation. But the questions raised by Rose Harper's extraordinary testimony remain unanswered, waiting for future generations who may be better prepared to confront evidence that challenges everything humanity believes about the nature of existence and our place in a cosmos that may be far more dangerous and demanding than our comfortable theological assumptions have prepared us to face.